When you watch the aerial combat sequences in the television series Masters of the Air, you might notice something that seems rather alarming at first glance. During those intense dogfights high above Europe, the camera angles sometimes reveal bomber gunners firing their weapons at incoming German fighters, while other American bombers are clearly visible somewhere beyond their targets, positioned right in the potential path of those streams of tracer fire. It's a detail that might make you pause and wonder about something that probably doesn't get discussed as much as it should. The question becomes almost unavoidable once you notice it. Just how frequently did the gunners stationed aboard American heavy bombers actually end up hitting their own side's aircraft during the chaos and confusion of aerial combat over occupied Europe and later over the Japanese home islands? This exploration maintains all of the essential facts and follows the same general progression as earlier examinations of this topic, though the language has been completely refreshed to present the information in a new way. Understanding the answer requires first understanding how these massive formations of bombers actually flew together through hostile skies. The bomber groups operating during the war years maintained formations that were both tight and carefully organized according to strict discipline. These weren't loose congregations of aircraft wandering across the sky in the general vicinity of each other. They were precisely arranged tactical units, with each bomber occupying a specific position relative to the others. The exact configuration and arrangement of these formations wasn't static throughout the entire war either. As German defensive tactics evolved and as new threats emerged from the Luftwaffe's fighter units, American commanders continuously refined and adjusted their formation strategies to counter these changing dangers. There's a declassified document from the final year of the war that sheds considerable light on the thinking behind formation design. This document, produced in 1945 by the Tactical Doctrine section of the B-29 Combat Command and titled Gunnery and the B-29, the Tactical Use of Equipment, devotes substantial attention to how formations were structured. According to this official analysis, the designers of bomber formations had to balance three distinct objectives that were constantly in tension with each other, pulling in different directions. The first and most fundamental priority was the reason these aircraft were sent into harm's way in the first place. The primary mission remained putting a concentrated pattern of bombs on the intended target below. Everything else was ultimately secondary to this goal. If the bombers couldn't effectively strike their targets, then all the other considerations became academic. The formation had to be arranged in such a way that when the bombardiers released their loads, those bombs would fall in a tight pattern rather than scattering uselessly across the countryside. The second major consideration was simple but crucial for the men who had to fly these missions. The formations needed to remain flyable over extended periods. This meant that the spacing between aircraft and the vertical stacking arrangements had to be organized in ways that would reduce pilot fatigue during missions that could last 8, 10, or even 12 hours from takeoff to landing. Pilots needed to be able to maintain their positions without becoming exhausted from the constant mental and physical strain. The lead aircraft in the formation was responsible for setting the speed, altitude, and course for all the other bombers to follow. Interestingly, the formation leader was actually the only aircraft in the entire group that was permitted to engage the autopilot system. Every other pilot had to hand-fly their position throughout the entire mission, maintaining their spot in the formation through constant adjustments to throttle and control surfaces. The third objective centered on defensive capabilities. The formation needed to be structured to maximize the defensive gun coverage that the combined firepower of all those bombers could provide. The idea was that aircraft positioned correctly could provide overlapping fields of fire, with the guns from multiple bombers able to engage any fighter attacking from a particular direction. This created zones where enemy fighters would face concentrated fire from multiple sources, theoretically making it more dangerous for German pilots to press home their attacks. Here's the fundamental problem that formation designers faced, though. No single formation arrangement could possibly optimize all three of these competing priorities simultaneously. Trade-offs were absolutely unavoidable. If you designed a formation that was huge and ultra-tight, packing the bombers in very close to each other, you'd get excellent bombing accuracy because all those aircraft would be releasing over essentially the same point. However, that same tight formation would be significantly harder to fly, increasing pilot fatigue, and it would also be easier for enemy fighters to attack because they could potentially hit multiple bombers with a single firing pass. On the other hand, if you arrange the bombers in a vertical stack, spreading them out vertically through different altitude bands, you might achieve better protection against fighter attacks coming from certain angles, but this arrangement simply wouldn't work during the actual bomb release phase of the mission. It was also impractical to maintain over the long distances these missions covered, as keeping precise vertical separation over hours of flight required constant attention and adjustment. The aircrews themselves had to function as cohesive teams within this larger tactical picture. Each crew needed to engage attacking enemy fighters effectively, while simultaneously being extremely careful to avoid directing their fire at other American aircraft in their own combat box. This required constant awareness of where friendly bombers were positioned and careful discipline in selecting when and where to fire. By the late months of 1943, significant changes were taking place in the operational doctrine of the 8th Air Force based in England. The air commanders were beginning to implement blind bombing techniques using newly developed radar systems, allowing bombers to strike targets even when they were obscured by cloud cover. At the same time, they were anticipating the arrival of long-range escort fighters that would be able to accompany the bombers all the way to distant targets deep in Germany and back again. These developments prompted a restructuring of the standard formation that had been used up to that point. The older formation structure had been built around a 54-aircraft combat wing, but this gave way to a different arrangement. The new standard became the tighter and more manageable 36-aircraft combat box. This smaller unit was easier to control and coordinate, though it still packed substantial defensive firepower and bombing capacity. The amount of ammunition that these bombers carried varied depending on which specific model and variant you were looking at. A 1945 document produced by the Army Air Force's Technical Service Command provides detailed breakdowns of these figures. This document, titled Tactical Planning Characteristics and Performance, lays out the specifications in comprehensive tables. For the B-17 Flying Fortress, these tables list numerous details for each model and block number, including the number of guns mounted on the aircraft, the number of rounds allocated to each gun position, and the specific type and location of each gun station throughout the airframe. The final production version of the B-17, designated the B-17G, carried a total of 5,240 rounds of ammunition distributed across all of its gun positions. This represented a substantial increase over earlier models, reflecting the growing importance of defensive armament as German fighter tactics became more aggressive and sophisticated. The primary defensive weapon mounted on these bombers was the Browning .50 caliber M2 machine gun, a weapon that had become nearly ubiquitous across American military aviation. This gun is profiled in detail in a 1944 manual produced by the Aviation Training Division, titled Air Crewman Gunnery Manual. According to the specifications laid out in this training document, the M2 cycled at a rate of roughly 750 to 850 rounds per minute when functioning properly. This translates to approximately 14 rounds per second when the gun was firing continuously. The theoretical lethal range of this weapon extended to approximately 4 miles under ideal conditions. However, there's a crucial distinction between lethal range and effective range that's highlighted in another wartime document. A 1945 report from the U.S. Air Force Historical Studies section, titled Flexible Gunnery Training in the AAF, emphasizes that for the flexible, manually aimed bomber guns using iron sights, the practical maximum effective range was significantly shorter than the absolute lethal range. In practice, gunners could really only expect to hit targets out to about 600 yards, which is roughly a third of a mile. This distinction becomes critically important when you consider the spacing within a combat box formation. Other aircraft in the same formation were well within both the effective range and the lethal range of these weapons. A gunner engaging an enemy fighter could potentially hit a friendly bomber, even if they weren't actually trying to do so, simply because the distances involved placed those friendly aircraft well within the envelope where .50 caliber bullets remained dangerous. The commanders who designed the formation spacing were aware of this hazard, of course. Because the lethal range of these weapons stretched so far, bomber formations were deliberately spaced with consideration for this factor. The idea was that stray rounds from one combat box would be unlikely to reach aircraft in another box operating nearby. The spacing between boxes was maintained at distances that would allow any missed shots or ricochets to dissipate their energy or fall away before reaching other friendly units. Training programs for bomber gunners placed heavy emphasis on target identification and proper sighting techniques. When you examine the syllabi for these training courses, you can see that subjects related to aircraft recognition and proper sighting procedures are explicitly called out in the course tables as major areas of instruction. Gunners needed to be able to instantly distinguish between German fighter types and American or British aircraft, and they needed to be able to judge range and lead effectively even under the stress of combat. So with all of this context established, we can finally address the central question directly. How often did gunners aboard American bombers actually hit aircraft on their own side? And beyond that, how often did they manage to hit parts of their own aircraft? The heavy bombers used by the United States during the war, including the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and the later B-29 Superfortress, all incorporated mechanical systems specifically designed to prevent gunners from accidentally shooting parts of their own airplane. These were called turret fire interrupters, and they represented a recognition of how easy it would be for a gunner in the heat of combat to accidentally fire into some vital part of their own aircraft. One specific example of such a system was the ball turret follower interrupter installed on B-17s. This mechanism established defined sectors where the guns simply could not fire, protecting the propellers from accidental damage. The system physically prevented the guns from traversing into angles where they might shoot off one of the bomber's own propeller blades. However, these interrupter systems had significant limitations. They couldn't protect components that moved or extended during flight, such as the landing gear when it was lowered or the bomb bay doors when they were opened. The systems were also less comprehensive for the waist gun installations, those manually operated guns positioned in the sides of the fuselage. The waist gun positions were carefully positioned and deliberately limited in their traverse so that a gunner's field of fire wouldn't intersect with his own aircraft's wing. You can actually see this in surviving footage of B-17F bombers, where the physical mounting and the restricted traverse of the waist guns is clearly visible. The guns could swing through a wide arc, but there were hard stops preventing them from pointing at the bomber's own structure. All of these design features and mechanical safeguards reflect the very strong emphasis that was placed on avoiding self-inflicted damage. The aircraft designers and the military planners understood that the risk was real and significant, and they took concrete steps to mitigate it through engineering solutions. The US Army Air Forces didn't just rely on preventive measures, though. They also conducted extensive analysis of where bombers were actually taking damage during combat operations. Understanding the actual sources of damage would help them improve tactics, modify aircraft, and train crews more effectively. A detailed report from 1944, produced by headquarters of the 8th Air Force and focused on combat losses and damage, documented each returning aircraft's battle damage in meticulous detail. Inspectors recorded every hole in the airframe, noting its location, the direction from which the projectile had come, the source of the damage, and the severity of the hit. This wasn't a small sample size either. The analysis covered approximately 25,000 bomber missions, creating an enormous database of damage incidents. The results of this comprehensive analysis were later summarized in a 1947 document from the U.S. Air Force Historical Studies series. This document, titled The Combined Bomber Offensive, January 1st through June 6, 1944, presents the statistical breakdown for both B-17 and B-24 operations during that critical period leading up to the D-Day invasion. The findings are striking in how clearly they identify the primary threat to American bombers. The largest single source of damage by an enormous margin was ground-based artillery, specifically the anti-aircraft flak that German defenders fired up at the bomber streams. This category alone accounted for 83.7% of all recorded damage incidents. Think about that for a moment. More than 4 out of every 5 hits that bombers took came from guns on the ground, not from enemy fighters. Air-to-air rockets fired by German fighters, aerial bombs dropped from above by enemy aircraft attempting to bomb the formations, and hits from the large 30mm cannon that some German fighters carried all together made up an incredibly small portion of the total. These 3 categories combined represented only about 0.1% of all damage incidents. They were spectacular and terrifying when they occurred, but statistically they were quite rare. Enemy aircraft armed with 20mm cannon contributed 4.5% of the total damage. The 20mm cannon was standard armament on many German fighters, and it was capable of inflicting serious damage when rounds found their target. German fighter pilots also used machine guns, typically either 7.93mm weapons or the heavier 13mm guns, and these contributed an additional 2.4% of the damage incidents. Here's where we get to the figures that directly answer our original question. Friendly .50 caliber hits, meaning rounds fired from other American bombers, accounted for 2.0% of all bomber damage incidents. Self-inflicted machine gun fire, rounds that a bomber's own guns put into its own airframe, added another 1.4% to the total. There were also some other interesting categories in the analysis. Damage from falling empty shell cases and the metal links that connected the ammunition belts made up 3.8% of all incidents. When those 50 caliber guns were firing, they were ejecting hundreds of empty brass casings and metal links, and these could actually cause damage if they struck another aircraft or re-entered the aircraft they came from through an open hatch or damaged section. Finally, 1.5% of all damage fell into categories that were either classified as other or simply unknown. If we combine the figures for friendly fire and self-inflicted machine gun damage, we get a total of about 3.4% of all bomber damage coming from their own guns. However, the report also included an important qualification that provides additional context. When enemy opposition was particularly heavy, during missions where German fighters were attacking in large numbers and flak was intense, the proportion of damage attributable to friendly or self-inflicted machine gun fire could rise to as much as 20% of all machine gun hits specifically. Not 20% of all damage, but 20% of damage from machine guns only. The report identified one particular source of self-inflicted damage that occurred with notable frequency. Waist gunners, in their urgency to engage enemy fighters attacking from behind and below, would sometimes strike their own aircraft's horizontal stabilizers, the horizontal tail surfaces at the back of the plane. This was apparently common enough to be specifically called out as a significant driver of self-inflicted damage statistics. What about the risk of friendly fire from the escort fighters that accompanied the bombers? Fighter escorts, after all, often operated within what was technically the lethal range of the bomber formation's defensive guns. Could bombers be hit by fire from their own escort fighters? The assessed risk from this source was actually considered quite low by military planners. The primary reason was tactical. Escort fighters typically engaged enemy aircraft before those German fighters could actually develop their attacks against the bomber formation. The American fighters would intercept the Luftwaffe fighters well away from the bombers if possible, breaking up their attack formations before they could close to effective firing range of the bomber stream. This meant that there were relatively few situations where friendly fighters would be firing their guns in close proximity to the bombers they were protecting. That said, there was definitely concern flowing in the other direction. Fighter units that flew escort missions were very worried about being misidentified by bomber crews who might mistake them for German aircraft. This concern is described in a 1945 historical account produced by the 8th Air Force Fighter Command, specifically from records of the 66th Fighter Wing. From the bomber crew's perspective, they simply couldn't afford to take chances with identification. The stakes were too high, and the time available to make identification decisions was measured in seconds. The rule of thumb that governed their actions was brutally simple. If any fighter aircraft points its nose at your bomber and is within firing range, you open fire immediately. You don't wait to confirm whether it's friendly or hostile. You shoot first and sort out the identification afterward, because waiting even a few seconds could mean the difference between surviving an attack and being shot down. Similar identification concerns cropped up in different contexts as well. During the D-Day landings, there was significant worry among planners that Allied naval vessels in the English Channel might open fire on American fighter aircraft operating overhead. Sailors aboard ships would see aircraft approaching and might not be able to quickly distinguish between friendly and enemy types, especially given the stress of the invasion and the expectation of German air attacks. One reason that P-38 Lightning fighters were specifically assigned to ship protection duties was precisely because of identification concerns. The P-38 had a completely unmistakable twin-boom silhouette that was essentially impossible to confuse with any German aircraft type. Even from a distance, even at a glance, the P-38's distinctive shape was immediately recognizable. This reduced the risk that nervous anti-aircraft gunners aboard the invasion fleet would shoot down their own air cover. This particular consideration is noted in a 1944 document from the 8th Air Force titled Tactical Operations in Support of the Allied Landings. The data on crew casualties tracked very closely with the overall picture painted by the airframe damage statistics. A report from 1962 produced by the U.S. Army Surgeon General's Office, titled Wound Ballistics, provides a detailed breakdown of what actually caused casualties among 8th Air Force bomber crewmen who made it back to base. These are casualties among returning airmen specifically, not among those who were killed when their aircraft went down. Once again, flak dominates the statistics in overwhelming fashion. Anti-aircraft artillery fire from the ground accounted for 86.2% of all crew casualties aboard returning bombers. 20mm cannon shells from enemy fighters accounted for 3.9% of crew wounds. Machine gun fire, both the smaller 7.93mm weapons and the heavier types, contributed 6.2% of casualties. There's also a category in these statistics called secondary missiles, which is worth explaining in detail because it captures some of the chaotic and unpredictable nature of aerial combat damage. This category includes fragments of plexiglass blown inward from shattered windows and canopy sections, pieces of the airframe itself that were torn loose by hits and became projectiles inside the aircraft, chunks of bullet-resistant glass that fragmented under impact, bits of electrical equipment that exploded when hit, and even .50 caliber ammunition that cooked off when exposed to fire or intense heat. These secondary missiles accounted for 7.8% of crew casualties. Finally, 1.5% of casualties were attributed to unknown causes. The distribution between aircraft damage and crew wounds follows essentially the same general pattern across both datasets. Flak represents by far the primary threat in both categories. The German anti-aircraft defences, with their radar-directed guns and proximity-fused shells, were simply devastating in their effectiveness against the bomber streams. The concerns about friendly fire didn't end with the conclusion of the European War either. During the transition to nighttime low-altitude firebombing operations over Japan in the final months of the Pacific War, the 21st Bomber Command had to weigh the risks of bomber-to-bomber fire very carefully as they developed tactics for these new types of missions. A 1945 report analysing the incendiary phases of operations flown on March 9th and 10th of 1945 reached a notable conclusion about these night missions. The analysis determined that the greatest hazard facing B-29s on night missions was actually friendly fire from other B-29s, not Japanese defences. This might seem surprising until you consider the circumstances of these raids. The bombers were flying at night, at relatively low altitudes, over a burning city that was creating enormous smoke columns and unpredictable air currents. Aircraft were scattered throughout the target area rather than flying in tight formation. Visibility was severely degraded by smoke and darkness. Under these conditions, gunners aboard one B-29 might easily mistake another B-29 for a Japanese night fighter and open fire. For the massive March 9th Tokyo raid, which involved over 300 bombers and created a firestorm that killed more people than either atomic bomb, B-29s were ordered to remove all ammunition from their guns before takeoff. The aircraft flew completely unarmed, except for tail guns on some aircraft. This was an extraordinary measure that reflected how seriously the command viewed the friendly fire risk. On the follow-on mission against Nagoya, tail guns were reloaded, but with strict instructions that they were to be used only if the aircraft was actually fired upon by a confirmed enemy fighter. For the subsequent Osaka mission, the lower turrets were loaded with ammunition, but crews were instructed to engage only ground targets such as searchlights or other targets that were clearly at lower altitudes than the bomber, where there was no possibility of hitting another B-29. To summarize everything we've examined, friendly machine gun fire represented a relatively small fraction of total airframe damage sustained by American heavy bombers during World War II, and it appears to have contributed a similarly small proportion of crew casualties. The documents don't provide a specific percentage for friendly fire crew wounds as a separate category, but we can reasonably infer that it likely tracks fairly closely with the airframe damage figure of approximately 2%. It's also worth noting that it's rather hard to imagine many scenarios where self-inflicted machine gun fire would actually injure members of the aircraft's own crew. The guns were positioned and oriented in ways that made this unlikely, though certainly not impossible if rounds ricocheted inside the fuselage or if there was some catastrophic mechanical failure of an interrupter system. There's an important caveat to keep in mind about all of these statistics. These figures come exclusively from returning bombers, the aircraft that made it back to base where inspectors could examine them and where injured crewmen could report to medical personnel. This means that survivor bias is inherent in all of this data. We're not seeing information about bombers that went down, whether they were shot down by enemy action, fell victim to friendly fire, or suffered catastrophic self-inflicted damage. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that friendly fire and self-inflicted damage represented a higher percentage of total casualties if we could somehow include aircraft that didn't make it home, but we simply don't have that data available. Based on the evidence that does exist, when friendly fire incidents did occur, they were much more likely to involve fire from other bombers in the formation rather than from escort fighters. The tactical employment of escorts and the general geometry of bomber defense made friendly fire from fighters relatively uncommon compared to bomber-on-bomber incidents. If you happened to be flying fighter escort for heavy bombers during the Second World War, there was one very practical lesson that the experiences of those who flew before you made abundantly clear. You absolutely did not want to point your nose at a bomber formation unless you were fully prepared to have every single gun in that entire combat box immediately swing toward you and potentially open fire. The bomber crews couldn't afford to wait and verify your identity. They would see a fighter nose pointed at them, assume hostile intent, and react accordingly. Many fighter pilots learned this lesson vicariously by hearing the experiences of others. Those who learned it firsthand usually came away with a very healthy respect for just how much firepower a combat box could bring to bear, and how quickly bomber gunners would engage anything that looked like a threat. The smart play was always to make your friendly status absolutely unmistakable, and to never, under any circumstances, make yourself look like an attacking enemy fighter by pointing your nose at the bombers you were supposed to be protecting.